Deathwatch, Chapter 5. Ben had given up hope of finding water. He stood on the edge of the cliff and thought bitterly that even the bighorn were against him. The big sheep had left a well-worn trail along the ridge of the mountains, which he had been able to follow even in the pre-dawn light. And such a trail should have led to water. Instead, it came to this cliff and ended, sign of the bighorn going off in all directions. It was a trick, Ben thought. Like Maddock, they were playing with him, killing him. Without water, there was no contest. All Maddock had to do was wait out the few remaining hours. For the first time, Ben felt a deep, almost paralyzing fear. It was not the sharp, mouth-drying fear he had felt walking away from Maddock and expecting the bullet to slam into him. This fear was deep inside him, a huge, dark fear, a foreboding. And then, when the first light of the sun touched the ground at the base of the cliff, he saw the catch basin. A small one, a hollowed area in the rock perhaps 10 feet across, and he guessed not more than 3 or 4 feet deep. Bighorn tracks were all around it. To get to the water, they had pawed the sand out of the hollow so that it formed a sort of fan around the basin. As he looked down, the dark fear inside him seemed to shrink a little, to withdraw a little. Not 50 feet from him there was water. Not much. The hollow was small and shallow, and the bighorn had been working it. But the sand showed some dampness, and he had better implements than the bighorn. His hands were more efficient than their hooves and could do a better job. With his hands, he could scoop the sand out of the natural bowl, which slow erosion had formed in the rock. He would have to squeeze the dampness out of each handful of sand until, when all the sand was scooped out, there would be a little bitter-tasting muddy water collected there from the rains of a month ago or so. To reach the basin, he had a choice of getting down the cliff, which was about 12 feet high, or walking along it until it merged again into the mass of the mountain, descending in an easier slope. Ordinarily, this would have been a simple decision. Now he stood for a long time, measuring distances, with his eyes engaging the pain in his body. Looking over the edge of the vertical cliff, he could see a rubble of sharp broken stones at the foot of it, with fresh sand scattered on them by the bighorn. To hang by his hands and drop the last 4 or 5 feet onto those stones was going to hurt and probably add new cuts to his already lacerated feet. On the other hand, it was a long and painful walk along the cliff and down and then back to the basin. A time-consuming walk, and with the sun already above the eastern mountains, he didn't have much time before the real heat hit. From the top of the cliff, he could see the Jeep parked at the base of the mountains. Maddock had made a neat camp there, putting up the tent and stretching the canvas awning. There was no sign of him, but he could easily be sitting comfortably in the canvas folding chair in the deep shade under the awning, watching him. Ben got down on his hands and knees and eased his body over the edge of the cliff, showing the swing downward with his legs and knees rather than with his sore feet. Even when he was hanging by his hands from the cliff edge, he hesitated. The idea of impact of his feet on the stones below holding him plastered against the cliff face. Whatever it was smacked into the cliff with a hard, dry sound. A little cloud of dust, the rock particles big enough to see, leaped out from the flat stone face, hung a second, and then dropped away. Ben knew that he had been hit even as he let go of and dropped. It seemed to him, as he fell, that he had been hit even before he heard the sound and saw the dust, although he knew that it had not been that way. Something had hit him high on the cheek, hard enough to push his head to one side, but not the force of a bullet. Falling, he realized that it had been either a chip of rock from the face of the cliff, broken off by the bullet, or a part of the bullet itself, shattered and ricocheting. Then, still falling, he heard the sound of the rifle. Maddox was shooting at him with the Hornet, not the .358. In a box in the Jeep, he had 100 rounds for the Hornet. Maddox had started with 25 rounds for the big gun and had about a dozen left. At the first contact with the ground, Ben made his legs and knees go limp, so that he landed almost collapsed, his hands taking some of the weight. The pain made him grunt out loud. Blood running down his chest suddenly made him aware of the pain in his cheek. He felt it lightly with his fingers, but could only tell that there was an open cut about an inch long just below his eye. There were new cuts on his feet also. One of them, near his ankle, was bleeding rather badly. Even squatting there, he had a view of the camp below, and now saw that Maddox was kneeling in the back of the Jeep, the Hornet lying across the canvas top. Ben felt a wave of defeat as he pushed himself up with his hands and at last stood straight. He could not tell from here whether the catch basin was in view of the Hornet's scope, but as he started toward it, he had a strange feeling of inevitability. The basin would be in easy range and clear view. Ben just knew that. This time he heard the bullet go past him. It was so close that he heard not only the sharp little click noise it made in flight, but the actual sound of the stone beyond him. Then the crack of the rifle rolled lazily up to him. Would Maddox deliberately shoot him, he wondered? Ben decided that he had to find out. Ignoring the pain in his feet, he leapt forward, running as hard as he could toward the catch basin. Little noisy explosions on the cliff face went ahead of him all the way, the bullets missing him by inches. The man was a good shot, leading his target very accurately. Ben threw himself forward on his stomach. The catch basin was at the bottom of a small depression, and when he lay flat down this way, perhaps Maddox could not see him. There was a silence from the desert as Ben inched forward, using his bare elbows against the stone. The bullet struck just in front of his face, filling his eyes with sharp, dry dust which smelled of ozone. Ben pushed on, reaching out to the edge of the basin. The bullet knocked rocks out from under his fingers. Maddox was now standing on the hood of the Jeep, his arm in the rifle sling. That was not as good as having the rifle barrel resting across the top of the Jeep. Not as steady. A little gust of wind, a little tremor from a heartbeat, and, whether Maddox wanted it or not, the bullet would hit him. A piece of quartz just in front of his eyes suddenly split open, showering him with bright crystals. Even if he was not hit directly by a bullet, these sharp slivers of rock flying around could take his eyes out. Ben rolled over on his back and sat up, waving his arms around. Then he pushed himself up to his feet. Ben made a helpless gesture with his arms and turned away from the basin, walking slowly, picking his way. As he went back to the top of the range, he studied the bighorn sign, hoping to find another trail that would lead him to another waterhole. But, except for the trail he had followed, there was only sign of aimless wanderings. Near the summit, he sat down in the shade on the western side of an outcrop of stone. He found with his fingers that his face had stopped bleeding. The flesh around the cut was painful now, and he could tell that it was swelling. His feet were in bad shape, old cuts broken open, new cuts still bleeding. The slow, small, irritating desert flies arrived and swirled around him. They were so stupid, so suicidal, but killing them only seemed to make them increase in number. They wandered in and out of his wounds, or sat and preened their wings, or even bred, flitting in his blood, and there was very little he could do. They had made a home of him. The jeep was moving. To Ben, it seemed as though the cloud of light brown dust was pushing the white body of the jeep forward, bouncing it along on the desert. About a mile from the mountains where he was, an old eroded butte rose at an angle from a low-cut terrace. Ben watched Maddox force the jeep up the sloping walls of the terrace and, once on it, turned the jeep so that it was facing him. Maddox got out, and although Ben could not see exactly what he was doing, it appeared that he was slowly scanning the area ahead of him. Ben had studied that butte and cut terrace in the moonlight, realizing that its location made it a serious threat to anything he might want to do. He had hoped that Maddox, without the panorama he had, would not recognize the advantage the terrace would give him. It depressed Ben to see the jeep parked there, Maddox now back under the shelter of the roof, invisible in the heavy shadow. From the terrace, Maddox could see the entire south side of Ben's little mountain range, from the eastern to the western end. He could also see the wide stretch of open desert between Ben's small range and the high ranges in the distance, which surrounded this egg-shaped bowl of desert. From Maddox's vantage point, the only area he could not see was the north of the mountain range. A man with sufficient water and food, with clothing to protect him from the sun, with good boots on uninjured feet and sunglasses to keep his eyes from burning out, could escape from Maddox by simply going down the north side of the mountains and hiking out across the desert, heading due north so as to keep the mountains between him and Maddox. An injured man, almost naked, with no water and no food, could not venture into that northern area. For at least 100 miles, there was nothing but open desert, worn and gently rolling, the surface of the ground littered with small rocks and stones, with here and there the sprouts of the tenacious and enduring desert plants. There would be no catch basins of water out there. There were not even any barrel cactus, the water-soaked flesh of which could keep a man alive, provided he could somehow cut through the leather, tough skin of the plant. To the north was the only route he could take and not be seen by Maddox. But as things stood, now with almost 24 of his 48 hours of life already gone, he could not survive 10 of those 100 long miles. Ben realized that Maddox must have come to the same conclusion, and so he sat watching through the binoculars, knowing that Ben had only 3 choices: to stay where he was, some water near him but made unavailable to him by the hornet; to come down from the mountain and to start walking across the desert to the east. Maddox would not even have to move the jeep, but could just sit up there on the cut terrace and watch Ben die somewhere out in the empty 65 miles. Or to come down and walk to the west. Naked and with no water, there was small difference between 65 miles one way and 35 the other. almost numb to the aggravation of these flies walking around on his face. Ben looked across through the heat-shimmering air at the white Jeep. It seemed poised and ready to go to follow him, grinding along slowly in four-wheel drive. Ben tried to remember how much water Maddox had but gave up, realizing that he had far more than enough to outlast him. And there was gas enough to keep the Jeep roaming around for at least 100 miles in four-wheel, 200 in two-wheel. Mechanics, machines, supplies were not a part of this game. In the final analysis, even the guns were not part of it. Sitting in the hot, still heat, the flies crawling endlessly on him, Ben felt everything dropping away. He thought of search parties he had been on looking for tourists who had left the main highway to do a little rock hounding or have a picnic. People who had allowed some small accident like a stalled car or a broken axle to kill them. He remembered a little family of 4, parents and 2 children, who had died on the desert within sight of the highway. That family had done everything wrong. When their car stalled and they couldn't get it started again, they had walked away from it, leaving 5 or 6 gallons of dirty but drinkable water in the radiator. They had walked away from the shade it could have given them, walked away from the evidence of trouble the search party would look for. And they had walked away in the daylight, in the sunlight, in the killing heat. When Ben found them, it had almost made him cry to see how the mother had smeared lipstick on the faces of her children in a futile effort to keep the sun from burning the flesh off them. Ben had always thought that he could survive in this desert he knew so well as long as he could move. He could move if you called stumbling on those torn feet moving. He could move for about 24 hours more, and that was all. All night long, he had hoped that with the coming of day, Maddox would realize that he was making a fatal mistake. That to kill Ben out here would be far more dangerous than confessing the accident and taking his chances with the jury. Now Ben admitted to himself that Maddox, as intelligent as he was too vain to give up. Vain and conceited and sure of himself, sure that he could convince the authorities that Ben had killed a man. Maddox would tell a simple, convincing story. Ben had killed the man, and when Maddox had insisted on reporting it to the authorities, he had tried to kill him too, but Maddox had escaped to the Jeep and made his way back. Maddox would tell it well, Ben decided. All the details would fit. He might even go so far as to wound himself to make it more convincing. Maddox would see to it that all the evidence supported him. The old man, ruined by vultures by the time they found him, would be wearing his clothes again and his boots and hat. The 2 hornet slugs would be easy to find. Ben would also have his clothes on. Maddox would find him where he had at last dropped and would dress him and equip him with empty canteens and a gun and food. It was too late now for any reconciliation. Too late to just walk off this mountain and go to Maddox and beg for his life. He fought back the fear. As long as there's water on this mountain, he told himself, I'm not dead. Tonight, he planned, when the moon goes down, I'll go back to the catch basin. To keep Maddox from seeing me, I'll crawl all the way there on my stomach. But I'll get there. With the dry heat pressing in on him from every direction, Ben relaxed against the outcrop and forced himself to stop the squirrel cage thinking, to empty his mind and sleep.